never meant for any of this to happen. Standing in the dimly lit university archives where Jaxon spends his days preserving historical architectural drawings, I watch him meticulously restore a century-old blueprint. His careful hands move across the delicate paper with the same precision he applies to everything in life. The basement archive smells of old paper and time, illuminated by the specialized LED lights that protect the fragile documents. Jaxon's silver-streaked dark hair catches the light as he bends over his work table, that premature gray he got in his 20s, just like his father. I know this because Flint told me, back when we were together, back when things were simple, back when I wasn't the guy who fell in love with his ex's brother. You're staring again, Kairo, Jaxon says without looking up from the blueprint. He's wearing one of those vintage-style waistcoats he favors, sleeves carefully rolled to protect them from the restoration chemicals. The contrast between him and Flint couldn't be more stark. Where Flint is all spontaneous energy and bright colors, Jaxon is historical precision and measured words. Force of habit, I reply, leaning against a filing cabinet. Watching archivists work is like watching dust settle, but somehow more pretentious. He glances up then, that hint of a smile I've come to look for playing at the corners of his mouth. Says the literary agent who once gave a 40-minute lecture on the historical significance of M-dashes. That was different. M-dashes are the unsung heroes of punctuation. Of course they are. He straightens up, stretching his back. Hand me that folder on your left? The one labeled 1923. I pass him the folder, our fingers brushing briefly. The small contact shouldn't affect me this much, but it does. Flint never understood my fascination with books and history. He was always chasing the next thrill, the next adventure. But Jaxon understands the value of things that last. 6 months ago, when Flint and I ended things, I promised myself I'd keep my distance from the Williams family. It was the right thing to do, clean break and all that. But then Jaxon reached out about a collection of architectural journals he was archiving, knowing I had contacts in the publishing industry. One consultation led to another, and suddenly I was spending my free afternoons in this basement, surrounded by the ghosts of buildings past, and a man I couldn't stop thinking about. The breakup with Flint wasn't dramatic. We simply faded, like the ink on these old blueprints Jaxon worked so hard to preserve. We wanted different things. He craved adventure and spontaneity, while I sought depth and permanence. When we finally admitted it wasn't working, it felt more like relief than heartbreak. You've gone quiet, Jaxon observes, carefully placing a protective sheet over the blueprint he's working on. Lost in those literary thoughts again? Just thinking about how things change. How these buildings you preserve. Some still stand, some are gone, but their stories remain. That's unusually poetic for 4 in the afternoon. He moves to the climate-controlled storage unit, his movements deliberate and precise. Something on your mind? I watch him work, appreciating how his waistcoat fits perfectly across his shoulders. Flint called me this morning. Jaxon's hands pause briefly before continuing their task. Ah, and how is my brother's great Southeast Asian adventure going? He's coming home next week. The words hang in the air like dust motes caught in the archive's filtered light. Flint has been traveling for 4 months, finding himself, or whatever people call it when they run away from their lives. I've been carefully not thinking about his return. I see. Jaxon closes the storage unit and turns to face me. That's why you've been hiding down here all afternoon. I'm not hiding. I'm appreciating historical architecture. Kairo. His voice has that gentle tone he uses when handling particularly fragile documents. We need to talk about this. I try for innocence, but it falls flat in the honest light of the archive. Don't. He moves closer, close enough that I can smell the preservation chemicals on his clothes mixed with something uniquely him. You know exactly what I mean. These afternoons in the archive, the late-night texts about book preservation techniques, the way you look at me when you think I'm focused on my work. My throat goes dry. Jaxon, let me finish. He runs a hand through his hair, a rare display of frustration from someone usually so composed. I've spent my entire life being the responsible one, the steady one, the one who preserves things instead of breaking them. And believe me, I've analyzed this from every angle. It's messy and complicated and probably a terrible idea, but I hear myself ask, barely breathing. But I can't stop thinking about you either. The confession echoes softly in the quiet space, bouncing off shelves of architectural history and centuries of stored memories. I should say something sensible about boundaries and family loyalty. Instead, I find myself stepping closer until we're sharing the same air. It would hurt him, I say, because someone has to. I know. His hands clench at his sides. But what hurts more is pretending I don't feel what I feel. I'm tired of being the one who always does the right thing at the expense of his own happiness. When did you know? I ask, needing to understand how we got here. Remember that day you helped me catalog the Art Deco collection? You spent hours organizing the files, creating this brilliant cross-reference system. You were so excited about these old buildings, seeing stories where most people just see measurements and lines. I looked at you and thought, oh, there you are. Where have you been? He laughed softly. And then I felt like the worst brother in the world. I remember that day too. I remember how Jaxon's usual professional mask had slipped just enough to show genuine enthusiasm for my organizational schemes. I remember wanting to see that light in his eyes again. We can't go back from this, I warn him. Once we say these things out loud, they become part of the record. Like these buildings you preserve, the story will always be there. I don't want to go back. He reaches out, slowly enough that I could step away if I wanted to, and touches my face. His fingers are cool from handling the climate-controlled documents. I want to go forward, even if it's complicated, even if it's hard. And there it is, the fundamental difference between the Williams brothers. Flint always chose the easy path, the fun path, the path of least resistance. But Jaxon faces things head-on, accepts the difficulty, and moves forward anyway. I lean into his touch. Your family will eventually understand or they won't. I'm 34 years old, Kairo. I can't keep preserving everyone else's happiness at the cost of my own. Even if one of those people is your brother? Even then, his thumb traces my cheekbone. Flint and I love each other, but we're different people. He'll be hurt, yes, but he'll also understand, eventually, that what you and I have isn't about him. It's about how you see beauty in the things I preserve. About how you make me laugh when I'm taking my work too seriously. About how, when I'm with you, I don't feel like I have to be the responsible one all the time. I close my eyes, overwhelmed by the truth of it all. I think I've been falling for you since that first day in the archives. I just didn't want to admit it. I know. You get this look when you're interested in something, like you're cataloging every detail for future reference. I open my eyes to glare at him. I do not have a look. You absolutely do. It's endearing, actually. The easy banter feels right, even here among the serious weight of historical documents. I realize that's what's different about this. With Flint, everything was always heightened, dramatic, intense. With Jaxon, even the serious moments have an undertone of comfort, of belonging. So what now? I ask because someone has to be practical. Now, Jaxon says, we finish preserving this blueprint. Then we figure out how to tell Flint, together. And then, he smiles, and it transforms his whole face. Then we see where this goes, one careful step at a time. I look around the archive, at all these preserved moments of the past surrounding us. I like that plan. You would. It involves old books and proper documentation. We stand there in the filtered light, surrounded by the stories of things that were built to last, both aware that we're standing on the edge of something that could either break us or make us stronger. It won't be easy. There will be difficult conversations, uncomfortable family gatherings, and probably some doors slammed in our faces. But looking at Jaxon, steady, thoughtful Jaxon, who preserves the past while building his future with careful deliberation, I think it might be worth it. I never meant for any of this to happen. But standing here in this basement archive, watching his ex-boyfriend's brother handle history with loving care, I'm glad it did. 1 week later, the familiar scent of old paper and preservation chemicals lingers on my clothes as Jaxon and I leave the archive. We've spent the past week dancing around the inevitable Flint's return and the conversation we need to have. Tonight's family dinner looms ahead of us like one of those imposing Gothic structures in Jackson's architectural drawings. You're fidgeting with your tie again, Jaxon observes as we walk to his car. He's still wearing that waistcoat I love, the one that makes him look like he stepped out of a vintage photograph. And you're still pointing out my nervous habits, I retort, but there's no heat in it. Are we really doing this? Unless you'd prefer to hide in the archives forever, cataloging architectural journals. He unlocks his sensible sedan, so different from Flint's flashy sports car. Though I wouldn't entirely blame you if you did. The drive to the Williams family home is quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. Jackson's hands are steady on the wheel, but I notice how he keeps checking his phone, waiting for the inevitable text from Flint, confirming he'll be there. The Williams house appears around the corner. A beautifully preserved 1920s colonial revival that Jaxon once told me his father bought specifically for its historical significance. It seems fitting that the Williams family lives in a house that belongs in an archive. As we pull into the driveway, Flint's newly acquired vintage motorcycle is already parked there, alongside his parents' cars. My stomach drops. He's here early, Jaxon says, his voice carefully neutral. That's unexpected. Your brother always did have a flair for dramatic timing. Jackson's hand finds mine across the center console. We stick to the plan. Direct and honest, like we discussed. Like ripping off a Band-Aid? More like careful document restoration, methodical and precise. He squeezes my hand. But yes, essentially like ripping off a Band-Aid. We're barely out of the car when the front door opens. Mrs. Williams stands there, elegant as always in her perfectly tailored dress. Jaxon, darling. And, Kairo? Her smile falters for just a moment. I wasn't expecting. Well, come in, both of you. The foyer smells of lemon polish and history. Flint is sprawled in the living room, his tan from Southeast Asia making him look like a golden god against the formal furniture. He looks up from his phone, and for a moment, I see the flicker of confusion, followed by understanding, followed by something darker. Well, he says, standing slowly. This is interesting. Flint, Jaxon acknowledges, his voice carrying that same careful tone he uses when handling fragile documents. Brother. Flint's eyes shift to me. Mr. Williams appears from his study, reading glasses perched on his nose. I thought I heard voices. Jaxon, Kairo, good you're here. Elizabeth. Shall we move to the dining room? The Williams family dining room is a museum of carefully curated memories. Family photos line the walls. I remember them from when I dated Flint, but they feel different now, weighted with new meaning. Mrs. Williams fusses with place settings while Mr. Williams uncorks the wine. Flint lounges in his chair, radiating casual danger like a beautiful storm about to break. So, Flint says as his mother serves the soup, is anyone going to address the elephant in the room? Or should we pretend this is a normal family dinner? Jaxon sets down his spoon. Actually, yes, that's why we're here. His voice is steady, but I feel his leg trembling slightly under the table. Mother, father, Flint, Kairo, and I are together. The silence that follows is absolute. Mrs. Williams's soup spoon clatters against her bowl. I'm sorry, she says, her society smile firmly in place, but that's not possible. Kairo dated Flint. Yes, Jaxon acknowledges, he did. And now he's with me. Flint laughs, but it's not a happy sound. Of course he is, because why wouldn't my perfectly responsible big brother decide to date my ex? Is this some kind of delayed rebellion, Jaxon? Finally decided to do something wild and inappropriate. It's not like that, I interject, because I can't let Jaxon bear this alone. We didn't plan this. It just happened. Just happened. Flint stands, his chair scraping against the hardwood. What? You spent too many afternoons in that dusty archive talking about old buildings and suddenly decided to upgrade to the responsible brother? Flint, Mr. Williams warns. But Flint isn't finished. No, really, I want to know. Was this going on while we were together? Were you two having cozy little chats about architectural preservation while I was being the family disappointment? That's enough. Jaxon's voice cuts through the tension. You know me better than that, Flint. Nothing happened until months after you two ended things. And nothing would have happened at all if it wasn't real. Real? Flint scoffs. What's real is that my brother and my ex have been sneaking around behind my back. We're here now, I say quietly, being honest, because it is real, Flint. Real enough that we're willing to face this conversation. Mrs. Williams dabs at her eyes with her napkin. Jaxon, darling, surely you can see how inappropriate this is? What will people think? I don't care what people think, Mother. Jaxon's voice is quiet but firm. For once in my life, I'm choosing my own happiness over everyone else's expectations. Mr. Williams sets down his wine glass. Elizabeth, Flint, that's enough. His voice carries the weight of decades of academic authority. Our son is telling us something important about his life. The least we can do is listen. The silence that follows is heavy with unspoken words. Flint slumps back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. How long, he asks finally. How long have you been feeling this way? Jaxon and I exchange a look. A while, he admits. But we never acted on it until we were sure it was real. Until we were sure it was worth the complications it would cause. Mrs. Williams stands abruptly. I need to check on the roast. She hurries from the room, heels clicking against the hardwood floors. Mr. Williams sighs, cleaning his glasses with methodical precision. Give her time. Your mother's never been good with surprises. He looks between Jaxon and me. Are you happy? Yes, Jaxon says simply. We are. Flint pushes away from the table. I need some air. He stands more controlled now. Don't follow me, either of you. I need to think. After he leaves, silence settles over the dining room again. Mr. Williams puts his glasses back on and takes a thoughtful sip of wine. Well, he says finally, I suppose we'll need to reset the holiday dinner arrangements, and somehow, in that simple statement of acceptance, I feel the ground shift beneath us. It's not perfect. Mrs. Williams is still in the kitchen, probably stress polishing the silver. Flint is in the garden processing. But Mr. Williams's quiet acknowledgement feels like the first stone in a new foundation. Jackson's hand finds mine under the table, and I squeeze it gently. Like the buildings in his archives, sometimes the strongest structures are built on complicated ground. 3 months later, the autumn light filters through the archive's windows, casting long shadows across Jackson's workspace. I'm in my usual spot, leaning against the filing cabinet, watching him work on a particularly delicate set of Victorian-era blueprints. Some things haven't changed, but other things have. The tension that followed that fateful family dinner has slowly transformed, like the careful restoration work Jaxon does with his beloved buildings. It hasn't been easy. Mrs. Williams still purses her lips whenever I come over, though she's stopped making pointed comments about more suitable partners. Mr. Williams has become an unexpected ally, often engaging us in long discussions about historical preservation over Sunday dinners that gradually became less awkward. And Flint, well, that was the biggest surprise. You're thinking too loud again, Jaxon says, not looking up from his work. Something on your mind? Just remembering lunch with Flint yesterday. That gets Jackson's attention. He sets down his tools and turns to face me. It went better than expected, didn't it? It had. After weeks of tense silence following our announcement, Flint had finally reached out. He'd spent his time in the garden that night thinking. He told us over coffee about his relationship with me, his relationship with Jaxon, and what happiness really means. You were right, he'd said, stirring his Americano. What we had, Kairo, it was fun, but it wasn't real. Not like what I see when you look at my brother. He'd laughed then, a genuine sound. God, you two are disgustingly perfect for each other. All that historical preservation talk and literary references. It's like watching two librarians fall in love. Who'd have thought Flint would be the mature one? I muse, watching Jaxon carefully roll up the blueprint he's finished preserving. He's grown up, Jaxon agrees. Thailand changed him. Or maybe it was realizing that sometimes the things we think we want aren't the things we need. I move closer, helping him organize his workspace, a routine we've perfected over months of afternoons together. Speaking of things we need, Have you thought more about my suggestion? Jackson's hands pause over his tools. About moving in together? The lease on my apartment is up next month. I try to keep my voice casual, but my heart is racing. And I practically live at your place anyway. Half of my books are already there. Only half? I could have sworn your entire library had migrated over. He turns to face me fully. Are you sure about this? It's a big step. I step closer into his space. Jaxon, I watched you sort my books by Dewey Decimal Classification last week. Voluntarily. Pretty sure I've never been more sure of anything. That gets me one of his rare full smiles. The kind that transforms his whole face. Well, when you put it that way, he reaches into his waistcoat pocket and pulls out a key. I may have had this made last week. I stare at the key. You were planning this? I'm an archivist, Kairo. Planning is what I do. His eyes are soft with amusement. Besides, someone needs to help me catalog the rest of your books properly. The moment is interrupted by Jackson's phone buzzing. It's a text from Flint. Mom's finally agreed to let Kairo help with Christmas dinner planning. Says his literary sensitivity might actually be useful for menu arrangements. Consider this a Christmas miracle. You're welcome. We both laugh, the sound echoing off the archive's walls. It's not perfect, family never is. But it's real and it's ours, built carefully over time like the historic structures Jaxon preserves. So, Jaxon says, pocketing his phone, when do you want to start moving your books? Tomorrow, I suggest. Unless you need more time to prepare your shelving system, I already have a cataloging plan drawn up. He catches my look and shrugs. What? You know who you're dating? And I do. I know exactly who I'm dating, the careful, methodical man who preserves history for a living and who took the biggest risk of his life for us. The man who faces family drama with the same steady determination he uses to restore century-old blueprints. The man who probably has our entire future mapped out in one of his precise organizational systems. I love you, I say, because it's true and because I can. I know, he replies, that hint of a smile playing on his lips. You categorized your poetry books by emotional resonance instead of author last week. If that's not love, I don't know what is. In the basement archive where our story began, surrounded by the histories of buildings that have stood the test of time, we're building something of our own. It might not be conventional, and it might have started in an unexpected way, but like the structures in Jackson's beloved blueprints, it's built to last. And somewhere across town, I know Flint is probably rolling his eyes at how perfectly nerdy his brother and his ex turned out to be for each other. Some things, after all, are just meant to be preserved.